Everything you've been told about what makes a house sturdy or warm is a complete lie, or at the very least, a massive misunderstanding that has cost people their comfort and their cash for centuries. Back in the mid 1800s, in the rugged, wind-swept landscape of Fishkill, New York, a man named Orson Squire Fowler decided to challenge every single rule of architecture that the world held sacred, and honestly, his neighbors thought he had finally lost his mind. You have to imagine the scene in this small traditional town where everyone lived in drafty, rectangular wooden boxes because that was simply how it was done. And then suddenly, here comes Fowler, a man already known for his strange ideas, claiming that every corner in your house is actually a trap for dead air and a drain on your soul. He didn't just talk about it, he started digging a foundation that looked more like a giant stop sign than a home, a bizarre eight-sided footprint that had the locals stopping their carriages just to point and laugh at the Octagon folly. They called him a dreamer, a crank, and a fool, watching from their porches as the strange shape rose from the earth, mocking him for wasting his inheritance on a building that looked like it belonged in a circus rather than the respectable Hudson Valley. But Fowler wasn't just building a house, he was conducting a massive, lived-in experiment based on the radical idea that the closer a building gets to a circle, the more it aligns with the laws of nature and the flow of heat. While the townspeople huddled in their squares, fighting off the biting New York winter with piles of expensive firewood, Fowler was obsessed with the math of the octagon, convinced that his home for all would change the world forever. The mockery reached a peak pitch when the first snow began to fall, with neighbors placing bets on how long it would take for the crazy eight to collapse under the weight of the ice or freeze its owner out. Fowler just kept working, pouring a strange experimental mixture of gravel and lime, an early form of concrete he called gravel wall construction, further cementing his reputation as a local eccentric who had abandoned common sense. He claimed this thick stony shell would breathe with the earth, keeping the interior dry while the wood rot claimed the houses of his critics. But to the people of Fishkill, it just looked like he was building a tomb. They didn't understand that he was calculating the surface area to volume ratio, realizing that by cutting off the sharp 90-degree corners of a standard house, he was actually reducing the space where heat escapes by nearly 20%. Every time a neighbor stopped by to make a snide comment about where his furniture would go in a room without square corners, Fowler would simply smile and invite them to come back in January. As the temperature dropped to record lows that year and the wind began to howl off the Hudson River like a banshee, the laughter started to die down, replaced by a cold, shivering silence in the homes of the skeptics. People were waking up to find ice inside their water pitchers and their breath misting in their own bedrooms, yet they noticed something deeply unsettling about the Octagon House on the hill. There was no massive plume of smoke pouring from Fowler's chimneys, and his windows weren't frosted over like theirs. It was as if the laws of physics were working differently inside that strange, eight-sided fortress, and the neighbors began to wonder if the madman had stumbled onto a secret that could make their traditional lives obsolete. But the real shock didn't come until the town's most vocal critic finally stepped across Fowler's threshold during a blizzard, only to realize that everything he thought he knew about survival was about to be turned upside down. When the door to the Octagon House finally opened on that sub-zero afternoon, the sensation that hit the neighbors wasn't just warmth, it was a total enveloping heat that felt like a summer afternoon in the middle of a New York graveyard winter. While the houses next door were struggling to stay above 40 degrees even with the fireplaces roaring, the Octagon was sitting at a steady, comfortable temperature that felt nearly 15 degrees warmer without any extra effort. The skeptics stood in the foyer, stunned into silence, watching as Fowler walked around in light clothing while they were wrapped in 3 layers of wool and still shivering to the bone. They touched the gravel walls and found them dry and radiating a soft, steady heat, a stark contrast to their own wooden walls that leaked cold air through every seam and joint like a sieve. Fowler began to explain the magic, which was really just brilliant, forgotten geometry. Because the octagon is closer to a circle than a square, it has less exterior wall space exposed to the elements for the same amount of interior square footage. He showed them how the wind, instead of hitting a flat wall head-on and forcing its way through, cracks simply wrapped around the angled sides of the house, losing its power to strip away the building's internal warmth. This wasn't just a house, it was an aerodynamic shield, a discovery that made the traditional four-vault construction look like a primitive mistake fueled by nothing but habit and lack of imagination. He led them to the center of the house, where a magnificent spiral staircase acted as a natural lung, pulling fresh air up through the floors and distributing the heat evenly to every room without a single cold spot to be found. The neighbors were looking for the catch. Perhaps he was burning a secret expensive fuel or hiding dozens of stoves behind the walls. But the truth was even more frustrating. He was simply using less wood to get more results. By eliminating the dead corners where cold air usually settles in a square room, Fowler had created a space where the air was constantly in a gentle circular motion, ensuring that the heat from the central furnace actually reached the people instead of getting trapped at the ceiling. The mockery in town quickly turned into a desperate curiosity, as the very people who had laughed at the stop sign house were now bringing their measuring tapes and notebooks, trying to figure out how to replicate the Fowler effect in their own lives. However, Fowler didn't just want to build warm houses, he wanted to revolutionize the way humans lived, claiming that square houses create square minds and that the octagon was the key to a healthier, more spiritual existence. As his book, The Octagon House, A Home for All, became a national sensation, hundreds of these strange buildings began to pop up across America, from the deep south to the coldest reaches of Canada, each one a monument to his defiance of tradition. People were obsessed with the idea of a house that could practically heat itself, and for a few years, it looked like the American skyline was about to be permanently reshaped into an eight-sided future. But as with any revolution that threatens the status quo, the backlash was coming, and it wasn't just coming from the architects who felt insulted by Fowler's amateur designs. A series of strange events and a looming national crisis were about to test whether the Octagon House was truly a miracle of science or just a beautiful, fragile dream that couldn't survive the harsh reality of the coming years. The craze for octagon houses spread like wildfire, finding that they really were easier to light, cheaper to heat, and surprisingly more spacious than they appeared from the outside. But the madman Fowler was about to face a storm that no amount of clever geometry could deflect. Just as his vision was reaching its peak, a massive financial panic gripped the United States, and the gravel wall method, which was supposed to be the cheap savior of the working class, began to face scrutiny from professional builders who saw it as a threat to their livelihood. Rumors began to circulate that the walls were unstable, that the odd angles caused mental distress, and that Fowler himself was more of a cult leader than a scientist, leading to a sudden and sharp decline in the octagon's popularity. Even in Fishkill, the very house that had proven the skeptics wrong became a target of gossip once again, as the world outside its warm walls grew increasingly cold and unforgiving. Despite the critics, many of the original octagon houses built in that era still stand today over 150 years later, serving as silent, sturdy proof that Fowler was right about the efficiency of the shape all along. When modern engineers go back and measure these historic homes, they find that the thermal dynamics are exactly as Fowler described. They are naturally more energy efficient than almost any other Victorian-era structure. The man who was once mocked as a fool ended up creating a blueprint for what we now call green building long before the term even existed, proving that sometimes the crazy person in the room is just the only one who can see the future. Fowler eventually lost his fortune and his famous house passed through many hands, but his defiance of the square box mentality left a permanent mark on the American landscape that can still be seen by anyone willing to look for the eight-sided gems hidden in old neighborhoods. Today, we still live mostly in those drafty rectangular boxes that Fowler hated, but as energy costs soar and we look for ways to live more sustainably, his folly is starting to look more like a prophecy than a joke. It's a reminder that just because everyone is doing things one way doesn't mean it's the right way, and that sometimes it takes a little bit of mockery to uncover a truth that can keep you warm for a century. The story of Orson Squire Fowler isn't just about a house, it's about the courage to be the only person in in town building something different, even when the wind is howling and everyone is waiting for you to fail. If you found this historical defiance fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the madmen who actually changed the world. We've got a lot more hidden history to uncover, and you won't want to miss the secrets we are digging up next week. Would you like me to write a short, punchy community post or a pinned comment to go along with this script to help boost your engagement?